Hello, my name is Dominic John Pillay. I am an anaesthetic trainee currently working in Glasgow in the UK. I finished my high school in Sri Lanka and have been studying and working in the UK for the last 11 years. I have an interest in pre-hospital care, disaster management and trauma, and have been trying to understand the health implications of the recent attacks in Sri Lanka, specifically also by talking with individuals who are working in the hospital response on the ground in Colombo and Batticaloa. I thought I'd put this talk together to try and identify ways in which we can help within the private sector, and looking at the overall implications of what this disaster means for Sri Lanka from a health perspective specifically. So we'll start with the facts. This is the largest terrorist bomb incident that Sri Lanka has ever experienced, despite its long history of civil war. As of today, 359 people are dead and nearly 50 children, and nearly 500 more people are injured. At the time of writing, a large number of people are still in hospital, many of them in intensive care, some of them before surgery or after surgery, maybe needing further surgery to survive. Without adequate resources and without adequate care, some of these people will die. The deaths of these people, some of them, will be preventable. Until the end of this century, we will be having Sri Lankans living in the country who are physically disabled from these Easter Sunday attacks. The trauma, the psychological trauma of these attacks will affect survivors, onlookers, many people across the board for this generation until the end of this century and perhaps even beyond. However, if we do it correctly through the right channels and in the right way, with needs primarily at the focus, we can help. I thought I'd look very briefly at the timeline of attacks, describe a bit about the injury to give you an understanding of what blast injury means to a patient, talk about the challenges for the health service in Sri Lanka across the timeline, and evaluate ways within this timeline that we can help from the private sector. So on the 21st, Sunday, April 2019, at just near 9 o'clock in the morning, simultaneous attacks in 3 different areas have left over 350 people dead. To give you a scale, in smaller non-capital cities, Negombo and Batticaloa. In Negombo, over 100 people have been reported to be killed in a single attack, and in Batticaloa, after a single attack, the hospital has said to have had over 150 casualties reached in the first few hours. The reporting on this is slightly sketchy, but to the best of my efforts, 150 or so, so a high scale for smaller hospitals. Colombo as well has had obviously a significant impact, but the infrastructure there is better. So blast injuries can cause a variety of disease affecting all body systems. A blast is essentially a rapidly expanding shock wave of extremely high pressure. It itself can cause injury, mostly to the middle ear, to the gut and to the lungs. Projectiles that are picked up in its path can cause blunt and penetrating injury, and this is the most common method of injury. People can be thrown against walls, and buildings can crush onto individuals, as well as the high temperatures can cause burns, and if these high temperatures go down patients' airways, they can cause inhalational injuries. A study in 2003 looked at all mass casualty incidents, so over 30 patients in a single incident from 1966 to 2003. A lot of this evidence from all over the world, some from high-income countries, and have found that for a terrorist blast injury, most people die immediately. So 20% of all the victims will die on scene or en route to hospital. For people who survive this blast, usually the mortality is low, and this really gives us an opportunity to meaningfully intervene and save people and prevent mortality increasing. Unfortunately, the effects to health are not limited to those who die. People who survive have long-term complications, which include loss of their hearing and eyesight, loss of limb, significant brain and neurological injury, injury to the bowel and use of stoma bags, chronic pain, and significant psychological injury. And remembering that this psychological injury is not just limited to people who are in the vicinity. This is healthcare workers, first responders, families who've lost loved ones. The list is unfortunately near endless. So if we break down the health challenges for Sri Lanka in the immediate and short term, for the immediate short, medium term and the long term, so if we're looking at the first segment of this, the immediate and short term, there are a few immediate challenges. One is that it seems that the capacity of our hospital infrastructure is already exceeded. We have very sick patients, and sometimes the numbers of sick patients needing ICU care does not match the number of ICU beds we have, so there is possibly a need to be moving these patients around the country. Some of this is already happening. Drugs and equipment and things that get consumed and for either single patient use or expendable items will be used significantly at the start of a hospital response. If these are not replenished, there is a significant shortfall which prevents pain relief, prevents surgery, and causes harm and even death. And there is obviously the immediate psychological impact and what this means for patients being able to engage in their care, but as well as what this means for healthcare providers and their abilities to continue providing effective care while being psychologically impacted. So if we look at the capacity of hospital structures, if we look at the map on the right, it's from the WHO. This is unfortunately 13 years old. I couldn't find a better map which looked at hospitals in Sri Lanka, but on the southwest you can see large general hospitals of a good size and density, but unfortunately the other two areas affected by this do not have that similar size. Negombo probably is the smallest of the hospitals with only a 4-bed ICU, as opposed to it appears 12 beds in the Batticaloa Hospital across surgical and medical ICU. So quickly we can see Negombo has been overwhelmed. So in an incident of this size, hospital infrastructure is rapidly saturated. In Negombo, a single attack caused over 100 deaths in the area of a small district general hospital, and very quickly, this is on I believe day 2 or day 3 of the incident, is a news report from Sri Lanka saying that they're running out of freezers for dead bodies. A major incident response within a hospital takes many forms, and the hospital infrastructure required to be able to deal with this is complex and interlinked. This includes staff, especially specialist staff, plastic surgeons, vascular surgeons, beds, especially intensive care beds, things to do surgery and keep surgery going on, and cleaning, things for patients who have passed away, transport vehicles to shuttle patients to and from, shuttle equipment to and from, communications and IT systems, discharge capacity beds. So if you have many people coming into hospital and your hospital is nearly full, you need to discharge people home. But can you discharge people home, or do you have the rehab or the home or the downstream capacity to be emptying your hospital to accept new individuals, as well as all the other vital things for maintenance of your equipment, cleaning and catering. I think it's important to remember that when an incident like this happens, your routine work does not change. You will still have patients who have an appendix burst. You will still have patients who have a heart attack. And despite your management of your major incident, you will have to continue with your quote-unquote routine medical emergency admissions. Sri Lanka doesn't have a large number of intensive care beds. This statistic is from 2013, but it appears at this point Sri Lanka has about 2.5 beds per 100,000 population, which is similar to Malaysia at that point in time. There has been an improvement in capacity, but clearly we can see, especially for pediatric beds, Sri Lanka does not have a large number of beds. This means that if the mats doesn't work, if you have more patients needing beds than there are beds, you need to then move beds or move patients or make new beds. So there is critical care transfers have occurred already. I've known of in Batticaloa they have been having to move patients from Batticaloa to Kandy and Ampara via utilization of hospital resource as well as a military resource. Unfortunately, when you're taking away anaesthetists or ICU doctors from your own hospital, when your hospital is undergoing an incident, that is a significant cost, but it is necessary. This need for critical care transfer is very important, especially when it comes to specialist groups. If you have pediatric or neurosurgical groups of patients, these beds may be few, skill set may be centralized into larger hospitals, so this need for transferring patients from one area to the next may be even more important. Foreigners, unfortunately, were also caught up in this attack. They will probably be eventually transferred back to their native countries. However, embassies within the private sector and the rest of the international community will be likely involved in facilitating that, taking some of this burden off the local national healthcare system. Using consumables used in a major incident take many different forms. This could be IV giving sets, IV fluids, painkiller drugs, bandages, gauze, various different things. There's clearly within the national system, there are national and local supply chains financed by the Ministry of Health. These may be exceeded, and what we're hearing is in Batticaloa these have already been exceeded, and purchasing and restocking of these consumables is absolutely crucial for allowing surgery and treatment of these patients to be ongoing. This is especially important for some specialist equipment and drugs, such as anesthetic drugs, and if people become forced to reuse kit or drugs, this increases a risk of cross-contamination and harm for patients. The psychological impact of healthcare staff needs to be also significantly considered, and how this affects your immediate ability to respond to this healthcare emergency. Staff surrounded by people dying, people stressed, and long shift patterns and very little sleep are going to be very, very significantly impacted. This is worsened by the fact that staff themselves will have lost loved ones at home. There is ongoing security uncertainty, and the curfews will serve to only worsen these feelings. And if we are going to respond effectively, the staff needs to be effective, and psychological first aid is essentially a term which has been used in a few places. The WHO have got some really good information leaflets which are underneath in different languages, and this shows how people in any circumstance can try and, like bandaging a wound, they can try to come to grips with what it's like to deal with psychological trauma in other people, and maybe instead of not just being able to go down and solve their issues or sit them on a couch and talk to them for 5 hours, there are things that all of us can do in terms of just the way that we talk to people, the space we give people, the things we say, the things we don't say. So it's worth having a look at and worth considering in terms of trying to maintain an effective workforce. In the short to medium term challenges, we need to consider rebuilding resilience within your healthcare system to your ability to respond to a disaster, and we'll look at that in a bit. When people start to come home, we need to consider the rehabilitation of these individuals, especially with light to their specific disease processes such as loss of hearing, loss of sight, loss of limbs. What the financial implications are going to be for these people returning home, what the psychological implications are going to be, and how taking care of them is impacted by losing loved ones. Nutrition is something I'll briefly talk about and mention, and it is important. And then also another significant thing to consider is how we're going to take care of a complex pediatric population who will have various psychological as well as medical and surgical requirements in the community. So in the short to medium term, rebuilding resilience. So disaster resilience is described as the ability of individuals, communities, organizations, and states to adapt and to recover from hazards, shocks, or stresses without compromising long-term prospects for development. This is a pretty wordy statement, but essentially it says, can we as a community or individual or group or healthcare system respond to anything that's thrown at us? Now, we have already seen that we have been existing capacity has been exceeded in our ability to respond to this significant terrorist incident. With ongoing terror threats, it is clear that we are at a capacity. We have no capacity to respond to another one in a meaningful manner. If another one hits, that will be the death toll will be even worse. And so it is really important that we attempt to solve this issue. Now, obviously, solving resilience of the healthcare system is a national priority and needs to be done on a national basis, but there are certainly things that can be done in a local sense to help with this. One of these things that can be done is considering whether we can help with provisions of emergency stores of drugs and equipment, and that will certainly help. In terms of if a secondary attack occurs, what will that mean for staff? Staff who are already overworked, stressed, and traumatized will find it very difficult to deal with a second attack. It is important that we deal with psychological trauma early on, and this will help their resilience and their ability to then respond in the hopeful case that it never happens, but in the horrible case that it does, a second attack occurs, then they will be able to respond to this. It's important to also consider how to build community resilience, and this is down to community spirit as well as education. There are some ways where the community can be educated in terms of first aid, specifically first aid, looking at a terrorist incident related first aid. Know how to deal with things like major hemorrhage, which is very easily treatable and can save a lot of lives in the context of a blast injury, and so perhaps this gap in first aid knowledge needs to be addressed. Taking care of people coming home. So on leaving hospital, people will need transport to get home, they'll need food when they get there, and they'll need a regular supply of medications and wound dressings. They may need crutches and wheelchairs, and they certainly will need to be put in touch with specialist services. People in a blast injury, the middle ear is very sensitive to pressure changes, and so a lot of the time you will see temporary or permanent hearing loss. With shrapnel injuries to the eyes, there will be temporary or permanent visual loss. With fractures and injuries, they will have disabilities with movement and with use of their limbs, so physiotherapy is certainly able to help here. With the obvious psychological trauma, psychological services can be helpful, and where specialist pain management is available, if available, that is useful to consider, but this is probably a bit too specialist. However, while we may not be able to actually get these individuals sight back within the few weeks they're back at home, if we can identify individuals who are vulnerable, who are already complaining of hearing loss, who have not yet got picked up by the system, we can then put them in touch with relevant people and follow them up to help with that. Sometimes people who are coming home with life-changing injuries might need changes to their living space to help them adapt to their living spaces. And then also, as people get home, they will be considering going back to work or going back to school, and this is something that is going to be challenging. When you lose your loved one and you are affected yourself, you may not be able to work immediately, and perhaps your loved one was the main earner of the family and they are gone or disabled and unable to work. This means that families will have an immediate financial shortfall if they have not got any savings or are unable to be met by help from elsewhere. Family members are also very crucial for helping with personal and medical care, taking people to doctor's appointments, cleaning and washing wounds, and if they are unable to help because they are themselves disabled, or if they are lost, this will be a significant impact. Clearly, psychological trauma of losing your loved ones is significant, and we've addressed this previously. And also, unfortunately, we have and UNICEF have already confirmed this, that we have got new orphans who have been created during this attack, and they will themselves require their complex care. Nutrition, I'm not able to really dwell on this too much because I don't know too much about it, except that it is very clearly important for wound healing. Nutrition is important for wound healing, for recovery, for regaining strength, and for rehabilitation and returning back to work. If you have poor nutrition in the recovery phase after a critical illness, you are less likely to recover back to your previous strength. And we need to consider how can we improve people's recovery with better nutrition, because there's an obvious concern that if you are injured, you're probably less able to feed yourself or cook. And so definitely the community comes into here, but we need to also consider whether this is an avenue for being able to help individuals. With pediatric care, this provisions of community pediatric care and liaising with secondary care in bigger hospitals can be very, very complex, especially after an incident like this. So making sure that children have access to this, especially the children possibly from more rural areas, have access to intensive psychological counseling as well as the medical or surgical care they require, is going to be a significant challenge. It's important to consider the long-term implications as well, although I'm not going to dwell on this just now. With patients who have suffered neurological, limb injuries, brain injuries, we need to think about how they're going to be cared for in the long term. Psychological trauma is also going to be a significant long-term factor in here, as is chronic pain from limb amputations, from wounds. That is going to become more of an issue in the long term as the cohort of people start to regain strength from their first disease. And then also we need to consider, how do we never forget in terms of disaster resilience and ability of our healthcare system and our communities to be able to respond to new threats in the future. So how can the private sector help? So the private sector can help in a few ways, and I've broken this down into the immediate and short term, as well as the short to medium term. The long term help, I think, is probably not worth dwelling on just now, but might be useful to consider in the future. So in the immediate and short term, it is vital that if the private sector is doing anything, that it works alongside and under the banner of existing healthcare services. It is very difficult to understand need, to keep a track on what is going on, and to respond effectively in a way that continues to garner public and local support, as well as the support of the healthcare services, if this is not done in the right channels. So it's extremely important that if the private sector is going to be able to respond meaningfully to this, that it is done by bolstering healthcare, national hospital healthcare service responses. It is extremely important that we rapidly assess need. As I mentioned at the start, there are individuals within hospital now who are going to die and going to be severely disabled unless they get the right care. So it's absolutely important that within sort of hours, not hours to days, not days to weeks, we rapidly assess what the immediate care requirements are, ask our local hospital administrators, and attempt to fill these gaps. And it's important that if we are giving drugs or stock, that these are done in a way that is in a sustainable supply chain if possible. It is best if these are done in as local a region as possible. So if drugs can be bought from Sri Lanka, it's bought from Sri Lanka. If it's bought from the South Asian subcontinent, it's done that way. These things need to be compatible. So if it's any equipment that we're going to be getting, it needs to be compatible with local systems, and it's worthwhile checking that. By just being available, by just saying you want to help, by just being a voice, a smile, a hug, a box of chocolates, or whatever it is, you will be helping healthcare workers who are on the front lines know that they are not alone, and this can be quite significant in helping them decompress. I've had some discussions with people on the ground there, and they've just said, thanks for calling, thanks for being Thanks for caring. Thanks for being available. We're really grateful for your help. And just that alone can really help reduce the stress and help frontline workers work effectively. And that is quite useful. And that is one way that certainly we can help by making frontline workers feel that they are being backed up and they are being cared about. It is important in the immediate term that we start to conduct a thorough assessment of the needs. Now, ideally, this would be of every individual patient who is within the system or who's been affected by this, who's already at home. This thorough assessment may need to be only tailored to the most complex needs. However, this needs to be started very soon. It is also useful to do this in the sense of looking at the system needs, so talking to doctors, talking to managers, talking to GPs in the community, talking to community leaders and seeing what their needs are and how we get from that sort of immediate term to that medium to long term response. It's important that we consider who we're going to use and what kind of money we're going to put towards a medium and long term response to this crisis. And it's important that we do that immediately so that the people who are going to be working on that can start working on that and start thinking about that, because we need to be able to respond and have the crutches in place and the wheelchairs in place before people start to leave the hospital. It's important that we also remember that there are ongoing security concerns, and that a second attack, wherever it may be, is always possible. Without creating alarm, I think it's important that we consider how we build this bolstering of local resilience into our private sector assistance. So can we, instead of buying, when they ask for four of one drug, should we buy an extra couple just to have them on hand? Should we be telling them that what they're doing this? Should we not? How are we going to do that? So I think that's an important consideration for, can we help boost local resilience in the short term before improvements in national resilience can come about when as we start to recover. In the short to medium term, getting patients home, do they need transport? Do they need food when they get back? How are they going to get their medications? How are we going to help them access that? How are we going to get them access to the special rehab? So do they need prosthetics? Do they need eye checkups, ear checkups? What do they require? How do we access them? Where are those people going to be who are going to provide that care? How do we bridge that gap? Psychological support throughout this process is going to be absolutely crucial. I've touched on this. It's not my field of expertise, but I am aware of technology and computer systems being able to help deliver education. So you sit down with a short education program. The education program teaches you a few psychological coping strategies, and this has been previously shown to be effective. So can we think about technology being used to deliver education which is scalable, easily portable, taking to people's homes, can be translated into different languages, that can help them cope with this? I don't know, especially, we need to be talking to psychologists to see what we can be doing. How do we get people back to work and school? How do we talk to teachers, to employers, to people, individuals themselves, to figure out how we help them with that challenging prospect? It's really one of the ways that we can be of use is if we have correct communication systems, data gathering and information gathering systems in place. Can we actually start to build up more robust medical records or care records for these people who have been affected, to try and find out in a way that a GP might have difficulty in doing and keeping tabs of all the information? Can we be better at helping with long-term follow-up and doing a dynamic needs assessment for these patients throughout their lives, really? Finally, restoring local resilience. Now, again, touched on briefly before, thinking about stockpiling of drugs or stock, if appropriate. Can we think about educating our communities? So how do you stop major hemorrhage? What do you do if you see someone acting suspiciously? All those kind of things. And do we need to think about local protocols? But I think that that's probably not the remit of the private sector just now. So, in summary, these attacks in Sri Lanka present us with an unprecedented and ongoing health emergency. The physical disabilities of this health emergency will be felt until the end of this century. The psychological effects could last generations. Now, while it's obviously important that we talk about security and accountability and how we help with sort of creating reconciliation between different ethnic and religious communities, fundamentally there are people at this point in hospital who will die or become severely disabled if we are unable to help bolster a very stressed local response. So if we cannot help these people and save these people from dying, save these people from disability, regardless of our other priorities, we have failed as a society. So it's really important that we are able to react effectively and quickly to prevent death and harm. Finally, I think in all of this, the private sector and the international community has a very unique opportunity to act in a way that really prevents severe harm by talking to the relevant people in charge and helping in a sustainable and needs-driven manner, and giving a coordinated response with existing local healthcare responses. These are a few references I've used and a few different news sources to try and prevent misinformation. Thank you for listening. Apologies for any errors secondary to sort of a lack of knowledge about specifics of systems, but I hope this has been interesting to listen to, and I hope that we can all work together to